precisely make a comment to yours because you're making the point, a very nice point about superstructure. And what goes beyond structure is something which incorporates also time.
Time, yes.
So it relates to Jamie's point that you go from a geometrical structure like a trajectory to a superstructure, which is a regime including time. And the beauty is that Leibniz at one place says, what I like about the calculus is that it frees us from the imagination.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
It's a really beautiful saying. That Leibniz sees that if you have, so you can also express it like, first you have variation and selection, then some selections are selected for stabilization, that's still in geometry. And then some stabilizations are selected for globalization. And that's Herbert Simon. Then the next system is there.
It comes down to repetition and revolution. And they have to be part of the same for a living system to evolve. If you want to crystallize systems, you can do that. And crystals are beautiful aesthetic patterns. But the reason why living systems aren't made out of silicon is because the bonds of silicon are so strong, they don't break apart. But you have this polyamorous carbon chains that'll, they're having orgies all the time, creating us, and so the ability to break bonds, yet keep the bonds together, that's a regulatory system that cybernetics has to focus on. And the most important thing is in our governing, how we govern ourselves, and what we talked about today, whether it be Netherlands, America, or today. How do we regulate ourselves? And cybernetics had better have something to say about it.
Thanks.
Well, I kind of make a comment. The first question is really that I think we have to be careful. And I say now, we have to be careful. That means our group, to talk always about we. Who are we? And when we talk about what someone has to do we have to do it? Or do I have to do it? Or you have to do it? I think are we conscious? We are not conscious. What is the we? I mean, we have to be careful about language. The second point is, I am really allergic too much to talk about consciousness and all these great things. This is fine. And I think maybe I am conscious about things, I'm aware of certain kind of things. I'm reflecting on a lot of things, but this doesn't mean that I know what other people do. So I think from that point of view, how do you know that someone else reflects? How do you know that someone else is conscious? Well, by asking, by getting involved in conversations, by looking at the language that is being used. So I think we have to be getting a little bit away from this highly celebrated human qualities, which are abstract and inside the mind of someone, to the language that is in fact with which we communicate. So that I think this is to me a big problem, that we get so quickly involved in these abstractions and don't say where it's embodied. Now, for example, you mentioned at some point, that we have to look for questions and not for answers. Well, this is I'm all for it. And in fact, you mentioned like engineers, and so they have their standard answers. That's correct. And I think this is what I was saying earlier. I think all discourses have certain ways of solving problems, medical discourse and legal discourse. And the interesting thing is, they don't talk to each other. If you want to, as a lawyer, if you want to talk to a doctor, and you talk to the medical discourse, so that there are standardized practices of defining problems and having answers. And I'm saying often that discourses look for problems, of course, they have the solutions and not the other way around. I think that's just why I try to shift it the other way around. And I say that is that the kind of problems that at least I think are worth solving are the ones where a system imposes restrictions on someone that are uncomfortable, that are oppressive, that are enslaving, etc., etc. So I think I'm a little bit, as I said, allergic against these kind of abstractions, and I'm asking, for example, where is the superstructure? Where is it embodied? That means we talk about in language, in abstractions, and I'm get a little bit annoyed with that. Sorry to say.
I like the idea of constraints that enable innovation, because the constraints of those two hydrogen and oxygen atoms being bound together creates something new. And that's where I think we need to be looking at the political alchemy of transformation. The ability to look at how can the structures agency that you talk about be enabled, fostered, that allows that recombination of the polymorphous perverse individuals to create a Elon Musk, Mars vehicle. I mean, it was over 35 years ago, I worked on the team that got from NASA the contract to try to get private industry into space. And, we had Wallops and we had IBM and we had, a few of these companies. Elon Musk wasn't there at that time, et cetera. But that started asking a question that wasn't before, was all about government doing it. It was, how do I sit there and enable the ingenuity of peoples to come up with something like a Elon Musk's little, SpaceX type things, which were not present when we did it, but we were able to engender the environment that people started saying, oh, I can put a guy on the moon. Okay.
Could I make a comment at this point?
Please.
Thank you, Jason. First of all, Jason, I want to compliment you on bringing three such well-informed speakers together on the same platform that were really excellent in reducing, or I should say maximizing, the signal to noise ratio. This is very unusual in cybernetics. So that the signal to noise ratio here was just really superb today. And I congratulate all three speakers on the clarity of their presentation and their capacities with language to express their own personal perspectives on the nature of nature and of the problem of problems. With that as background, I would like to comment on the relationship between what is standardly known in terms of systems theory, or the capacity or the desire of systems theory folks to use mathematics as a singular language, as a singular form of structure and of temporal relationships, to try and make a homogeneous pattern that explains all of nature. And by all of nature, I mean both human actions as well as biological actions, as well as physical actions. That homogeneity that is promoted by general systems theory is a scientific disaster, in the sense that it attempts to bring all the languages into a common form, even though the nature of the logic of these different forms of behavior are radically different. And particularly the logic of set theory as opposed to the logic of category theory. This homogenization leads to a massive epistemic misinformation. And I think Klaus is just brilliant in separating out the epistemic misinformation that connect social theory with biological theory or chemical or physical theory. And really, it's very important to recognize the distinction that Klaus is making and the clarity of those. And then in the next step of separating those into levels. The other issue, I think, is how you go about separating these levels, not just to the two axes that Lut presents, but into multiple axes where the reflection is across several scopes of languaging. Lut is very clear in his presentation about at least the necessity for having at least two axes of separation, one for weak anticipation, the other for strong anticipation. And this is a well-developed mathematics behind that by our mutual colleague in Liège. So that the clarity there is very high. But there needs to be more axes involved here, in my opinion. And this necessity for more actions means there are different logical forms of anticipation. And these different logical forms of anticipation necessarily require a separation of the logics from, if you would, the homogeneous set theoretic forms of general systems theory to relevant logics. That is, relevant logics that associate the terms of the propositions with the consequences of the terms. And these truth functions are always going to differ as you go from one scope of languaging to another scope of languaging. That is, from one set of silos to another set of silos. And these disciplinary differences that lead to expressions of our worldview, our Weltanschauung, that is so confused by epistemic misinformation. So I'll stop there, but I really have thoroughly enjoyed this presentation this morning. Wonderful work, guys. Keep it up.
Jason is happily receiving the praise, not lower to praise.
Yeah, I want to give some remarks both to Jerry and to Klaus. Let me start with Jerry. I think it is a fantastic intuition by Herbert Simon when he says there's always a kind of alphabet. So it's not 2, it's not 3, it's an alphabet. And sometimes that's 20 or 26 in the case of the linguistic alphabet. So, and I don't expect types of anticipation, I expect codes in the communication to differentiate. So you have different codes of communication. So Klaus mentioned some of them in problems, medical problems, political problems, mathematical problems. You get different discourse communities. You get different selection mechanisms of what can be tolerated and cannot be tolerated in the discourse. So yeah, I think I just wanted to communicate about the notion of alphabet, which is there. And I wanted to make a counter question to Klaus. If you say, I get irritated when people talk about superstructures, where is the superstructure? Then the answer, in my opinion, is that you can also ask, where is the rule of law? It's nowhere. And nevertheless, it is very important for how society is being structured. You can ask the same for Lowell's liberty notion. Where is liberty? Yeah, it's not in the Statue of Liberty. I just wanted to make that point.
If I may answer to just this question, I know exactly where the law of the Constitution is. Well, I live in Philadelphia. That's where it was done. I can buy the Constitution. I can read it. I can believe it, and I can act it. And I expect other people maybe they have the same documents available, and if they believe it and they can enact it, it becomes real. So the reality has something to do with how we individuals enact. And as I said earlier, to me, social organizations are abstractions. Abstractions we talk about with each other. We talk sometimes inside an organization, or we take sometimes the position of talking for an organization, like when the president of the United States says, I'm talking about for America or something like this, even though this is very strange, but that is at least what is being done. So it is always in the language, and it is always in abstractions, and it, sometimes written down and shared, but it is not just governing, it is participating in our own interactions, in our own communication.
I like
Could
your
I
notion of
respond to
enactment.
both Lut and Klaus at this point? Because Lut, I think the question that I was addressing, which is not part of Herbert Simon's notion of an alphabet. The concept of an alphabet is a sequence of different sounds, which then are symbolized by the complexity of the sound is reduced to a single symbol. And you then have simply a collection of sounds in the alphabet. That's not what I'm talking about. It's not what I think Lowell is talking about. It's far more complicated than that, or in my terminology, it's far more perplexed than that. And when you talk about silos of communication and different levels of science and emergent properties, the logics of these systems are radically different from one another, far more different than that associated with the notion of the alphabet. And so in the notion of scope, as I'm using the term scope and that Lowell cited, scope then refers to a complete symbol system and a logic. And so the symbol system for mathematics based on number has the logic of numbers. And Lowell illustrated that in his talk. The logic of physics is based on a small vocabulary of physical terms. These physical terms are coherent with one another. They're thought and imagined as being a situation of multiplications of units, and that restricts or constrains the degrees of freedom of physics. The language of chemistry uses still a different symbol system, the chemical elements. The language of genetics uses still a different symbol system, the language of genes, and the implications, the logical implications of proteins and dynamical structures and geometric forms associated with molecular biology. And then finally, if you want to skip up to consciousness and the social language, which uses then the alphabet that Simon was referring to. I think these are different perspectives of the notion of cybernetics and circular reasoning.
Thank you.
Well,
I just wanted to say to Klaus, the notion of enactment is very rich. Thank you.
Lucille, Richard, George, Larry, Stuart, Bob, Safras, Mark. We haven't heard from you guys yet. So who wants to say something after? Yes, Jamie, go ahead.
I wanna say it's like very interesting what Jerry said. So what I've been doing for the last couple of months, I really started working on Karl Popper's philosophy and explaining it. But one person whose work I've been using a lot is of Mark Noterno, and some of you may actually know him. And he, in his dissertation, introduced this concept of a paradigm shift between Frege and Popper. And actually, when I heard you talk, Jerry, I mean, it really sounded coming straight off the work of this Mark Nocturnal's dissertation that eventually became a book, in that he emphasized the paradigm shifting that happens when we go from one logic to another. And the way he describes that word is actually something that's happening in our head. Dus the way we kind of orient all our categories. And as Jerry knows, I'm actually very interested in category theory, because I think it kind of puts to the foreground the container metaphor. and that brings me back to loot. You pointed out that George Spencer Brown uses a box, or the concept of a box, but that's actually a container. And you could then make the link with category theory or Aristotle's categorical logic. And that gets us back to Alfred Tarski, who also uses that. And then Popper really likes Alfred Tarski. But Popper himself uses this concept of the category in these three worlds, that he says we need to think of them as like containers that have a relation with one another. And then we imagine, if we enter that container, how does the world look when we're inside it? And then when we come outside it. But then he also highlights over and again the interactions, and you could think of them as relations, like identity relations, as equal signs. And that brings me back to Lowell, who actually, you said an equal sign is an interaction. And so you kind of did it the Auschwitz there, because some people think of it as an identity relation, and you called it an interaction. And Frege, as a logician, was very concerned with what does that equal sign mean, and wrote, I mean, whatever, started a whole new discipline or way of thinking about logic. So very interesting. That's all that I want to say. Interesting connections.
One way of just summarizing what we're dealing with is Bateson and others talk about the map and the territory and the divergence of the two. What we're talking about now is not necessarily the correspondence of the map to the territory. We're talking how the map relates to the map and its formation, that then has consequences in the real world. By the way, our attitudes, our beliefs, etc. So when you go from the bottom of that levels of complexity waterfall I try to create with, reflexivity number 2, go up to reflexive number 1 to the nouns and verbs. We're dealing with a map of how maps are mapped versus just map corresponding to reality, the territory. And this is new, important work, because we are amidst problems that are the problem, and that's the problem.
Bateson goes even further.
Can I add something about the map and the territory? I think this is a typical problem that actually general semantics introduced, Korzybski, etc. The map and the territory are actually forming each other. Without a map, you wouldn't find much of a territory. If I take my car to drive from Pennsylvania down, I wouldn't know where the border is. It is the map that tells me so. And so I think the map is really creating a territory if we act on it. So that is number one. The other thing is, I mean, it seems to be that always the logic, trying to find a logic of how many things come together, many problems can be solved. I'm very worried about that, because that is not so easy. And we can get easily settled into causal networks or category theory or whatever. I mentioned the notion of gun violence. This is a real big social problem. And there are so many different institutions that provide or claim to have some solution of the other. And I think Russell Ackoff's definition of a map, saying that that complex, he talks about complex problems are problems that are interrelated problems. Well, then it's a question of how how do you describe the interrelationship? Now, if you think about gun lobby, if you as an analyst said, okay, then I'm using this and make a connection, so what? That doesn't solve anything. What might solve is when you get these various type of actors into conversations. And maybe, just maybe, there is a chance that one convinces someone to give something up and someone else to introduce some innovation. So I think, to me, conversations are very important, are more important than finding a structure that explains the conversation. Conversations are inherently evolving, they're inherently creating new things, and there's I think any sort of structure that would explain it would kill all conversations. So I think I would be just reluctant to have kind of a systems view imposed from the outside, from the analyst, and saying this is so. When one deals with social phenomena, one has to recognize that the people that constitute, that actively participate in a particular social organizations, they have to be listened to. They have to be part of it, and we cannot really from the outside determine that. And system theories ought to be very careful of doing this, and I would say they should just not do it. And I'm also saying this is actually often the source of of pathology. Like I mentioned, the issue of the bell curve, which was, statistically perfectly studied. There's nothing to object, but the interpretation and the social consequences are inherently confining whole populations and make it worse than what it is.
Looking at the nature of pathologies, I think we have another meeting somewhere gestating. We need to be looking at as Klaus says, in the conversation, I have my curse and cure. And the question is, how do I tease out the best and extinguish the worst that's actually in my conversation?
Bob has his hand up, but nicely.
Oh,
Let me just offer one thought to enlarge the conversation about the gun problem. It's something that Stuart and I have presented last year, which is to say that the gun problem consists of three parts, two of which you've discussed, one of which is people and their pathologies. A second is guns, which last forever. And the third one, which never comes up, is bullets. Because if we put substantial taxes and restrictions on bullets, it becomes much more difficult to kill people. There was a study done, and over the course of a decade, about 4,000 people were killed with guns, just with guns. They were hit with guns, they were beaten with guns, but they weren't shot with guns. So in terms of conversation, in terms of perspective, in terms of the different ways of looking at problems, let me offer, just as a suggestion, that you think about the gun problem in the context of bullets. Thank you.
This morning, Stuart sent to me an email mistakenly saying tax trash. And that was his byline. And I got all excited because I thought, oh, what a great way to limit people's consumption is to tax trash. Well, what he was talking about is he has all these IRS tax forms that he needs to shred. And he wanted to know where he could take his tax to the trash. So, but that whole idea of how do you look at a problem is a fascinating thing of governance and steering. And I think that's where cybernetics needs to go back as our application field.
So if I make a comment, actually it's about what Klaus said in response to Lowell. You automatically assumed, I think, that there was only one structure, because I think there's Klaus, this is where this thing of paradigm shifting comes in. Like, you have some system of categories in your head, and Lowell has one, and I have one. And so that's where the logical distinctions come in. Like, if we codify them, then we show how we're making distinctions. And now we compare or map or whatever you want to call it. And now we see, do we make distinctions in a similar way or not? And then if we don't, now we ask, why are we doing it in a different way? And then we start thinking, and maybe not. We shift a little in our thinking. And so I think maybe that Lowell was using the word, I mean, I think that Lowell is trying to say something like that. I mean, that is not saying, I'm going for the structure and follow me, and here is it, or here, that's the direction. It's more about how we use logic to articulate the distinctions in which we have grown up and how we are modifying them.
What we need is a different type of dictionary. Dictionaries deal with nouns, verbs, etc. The type of dictionary we need, building on Jamie's idea, is a dictionary of distinctions. And distinctions is not just of a G. Spencer Brown, it has an axis, because each axis then has resultants to the environment around it of where the two eyes are and the side of the head, etc. So we need cybernetics needs a dictionary of distinctions.
We still have several people do not have a chance to speak yet. Do you guys want to do a continuous session for this?
I think we need to rethink our question.
Yeah, you just mentioned that to do a dictionary, and I think the problem of a probleming process we may have more members wants to join the discussion. I'm just guessing.
The notion of a dictionary is actually to confine the speech to a standard form. That is, I think, very limiting. The dictionary is always describing how uses, past uses, codify past uses. And that's what we have to overcome. That's the reason why I'm getting into, fundamentally, I'm committed to the issue of conversation. That's like Jamie said, you give an idea, you get something back, you ask how other people make distinctions, but not necessarily to come to an agreement that there is only one thing, but to respect differences and move on.
What I'm interested in is something like someone asked me, well, Stuart asked me about what would be the response to the laws of physics and cybernetics. And so I put together probably about 20 laws, like the law of sequence. And in development, if you don't have the right sequence versus a noun thinking, it doesn't matter how you jumble them together. So that ideas of sequence would be the dictionary, would be an example. How do you define sequence versus confining? Anyway.
Well, you can do this within a particular discipline. And there are dictionaries of physics, and physicists think differently than the medical profession, and different than lawyers. So that this is really a prerogative of particular type of discourses, and not cybernetics. I think cybernetics is beyond that, to me.
Let's have an offline discussion of what the next problem should be.
Okay, Lucio, Larry, George, and Jerry, and Stuart, do you want to do a next session to follow up this?
I'm just content to listen.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
Perhaps a dictionary with 1 page and 1 entry conversation.
The
I just
alphabet
have
only
to
has
say-
one letter? Only one letter?
I just have to say maps is maps. Be it a
Thank you.
dictionary.
This has been fun. This has really been fun.
No,
Okay, okay.
Jason, in response to your question, I'll put together a categorical view of the use of dictionaries in constructing orders of cybernetics.
Just the use, you don't want to add the creation of dictionaries there? Like
Well,
George just mentioned the map, the action of mapping the map is also interesting, I think.
It's
Yes,
reflexive.
there is a logic to that.
Okay, thank
Also,
you
it's
all.
all maps.
Okay, we are 13 minutes past the hour. See you next time. And if you have that any new DAO, please send it to me. If you want to do a follow-up, I think they still have things to